They say that a single, casual comment on a random Friday night can completely unravel the fabric of your entire existence. I used to think that was just a dramatic cliché until it happened to me. My tragedy didn't begin with a smoking gun, a mysterious text message, or a lipstick stain on a collar. It began in my own living room, over a bowl of popcorn and a classic Hollywood movie. That single night triggered a devastating chain reaction that exposed my wife's shocking double life, led to an unimaginable, sudden tragedy, and left me holding the shattered pieces of my family. But the most incredible part of my story isn't the betrayal or the heartbreak. It's the completely unexpected ending. Because the very same woman my wife maliciously used as a weapon against me during our final, bitter argument would eventually become the savior of my family, teaching me that biology doesn't make a father. Love does. But to understand how I found my happy ending, you have to understand how the nightmare started. It was a Friday evening in late autumn. My wife, Chloe, and I had invited our oldest friends, Bob and Maria, over for a casual movie night. We had known Bob and Maria for most of our married life. Maria used to work with Chloe at a large, high-end travel agency downtown, and Bob was a supervisor at a manufacturing plant not far from where I worked as a commercial electrician. We were the quintessential suburban friend group. We spent our weekends doing yard work, attending our kids' soccer games, and hosting quiet dinners. On the surface, Chloe and I had the perfect life. We had a beautiful, well-maintained home, 2 wonderful children, and a marriage that I genuinely believed was built on a foundation of absolute trust and mutual respect. I thought I knew the woman sitting next to me on the sofa. I thought I knew everything about her. After debating what to watch, Maria finally persuaded us to put on an old classic from the late 1970s called Same Time, Next Year. If you haven't seen it, the premise is essentially a romanticized deep dive into infidelity. It's about a man and a woman who are both happily married to other people, living entirely separate lives on opposite sides of the country. By a twist of fate, they meet at a romantic inn, have a passionate weekend together, and then make a pact to meet at that exact same inn, on the exact same weekend, every single year. The movie follows their secret, illicit romance over the course of 25 years. While their spouses and children remain completely oblivious at home, these 2 characters maintain this intensely emotional, deeply hidden double life. As the credits finally began to roll, I noticed that both Chloe and Maria were wiping tears from their eyes. They were completely swept up in the romantic tragedy of it all, sniffling as the 2 main characters had to painfully part ways and return to their unsuspecting families. I sat there, shaking my head in absolute disbelief. I have always been a black and white kind of guy when it comes to loyalty. I don't believe in gray areas, and I certainly don't believe in romanticizing betrayal. What absolute nonsense, I scoffed, tossing the TV remote onto the coffee table. What do you mean? Maria asked, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. It's a beautiful story. It's so sad that they can't actually be together. Sad, I let out a harsh laugh. They are both actively cheating on their spouses and completely destroying the foundations of their families, and you both think it's a beautiful tragedy. They are cowards. If they really loved each other, they would get divorced. In the real world, people like that should be caught in the act and absolutely ruined. I expected a mild disagreement, maybe a playful debate about Hollywood tropes versus reality. I did not expect my wife to explode. Chloe sat up ramrod straight, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She turned to me, her eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious intensity that completely took the oxygen out of the room. "Mark, how can you be so incredibly cold?" She snapped, her voice trembling with genuine rage. They were truly in love. They only met once a year to keep that spark alive without destroying their real lives. It's complicated. Life is complicated. But I doubt you would ever be capable of understanding something that deep. I was totally taken aback by her hostility. "So, let me get this straight," I replied, crossing my arms defensively. "What you 2 are saying is that it would be completely fine if I just sneaked off to have passionate sex with my ex-girlfriend once a year, as long as I came home and pretended everything was normal. As long as you didn't find out, it's just a complicated romance." The moment the words left my mouth, Chloe absolutely lost it. "You bastard!" she yelled, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet living room. Bob and Maria froze, exchanging horrified, uncomfortable glances. "This isn't about you and your precious old high school fling, Jessica. This is about 2 people who actually share a profound, soulful connection, but you're too emotionally stunted to ever grasp that." The silence that followed was deafening. The casual, fun atmosphere of our Friday night was instantly incinerated. Bob cleared his throat, awkwardly patting his knees, and immediately announced that it was getting late and they needed to relieve their babysitter. Within 5 minutes, our friends had practically sprinted out the front door, desperate to escape the sudden, toxic crossfire. After the door clicked shut, Chloe stormed upstairs without saying another word, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, staring at the blank television screen. Something felt incredibly wrong. It wasn't just a disagreement over a movie. Chloe's reaction had been too visceral, too defensive, and far too personal. As I sat there in the dark, a cold, terrifying thought began to take root in the back of my mind. She wasn't just defending a fictional couple on a screen. She was defending herself. The silence that followed Bob and Maria's hasty exit was heavy, thick, and suffocating. I remained seated in the living room, staring blankly at the dark television screen, while the sound of Chloe's footsteps echoed sharply on the wooden floor upstairs, followed by the definitive, jarring slam of our bedroom door. I was left in the quiet, empty living room, the lingering scent of popcorn serving as a stark reminder of how quickly a perfectly normal Friday night could disintegrate into a battlefield. I didn't follow her. I knew better. I sat there in the dim light for nearly an hour, allowing the adrenaline and the residual heat of my anger to slowly leach out of my system. But as the minutes ticked by, the anger was replaced by something far more unsettling, a cold, hollow doubt. I started to replay our argument in my head, dissecting it with an obsessive, painful precision. "This isn't about you and your precious old high school fling, Jessica." Chloe's voice rang in my ears, sharp and accusatory. It was a strange, specific thing to bring up. Jessica was an ex-girlfriend from nearly a decade ago, someone who existed in a different lifetime, a different city, and a completely different version of myself. I hadn't thought about her in years. Why would Chloe, in the heat of a defensive, unhinged rage about a movie, instantly pivot to weaponizing a name I hadn't even uttered in a conversation for half a decade? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to click together in a way that terrified me. It wasn't just the mention of Jessica, it was the intensity of Chloe's defense. She hadn't just been arguing for a cinematic couple's profound, soulful connection. She had been fighting for her own moral justification. The defense was too visceral, the anger too sudden, and the deflection, instantly throwing Jessica's name into the fray, felt like a classic tactical distraction. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Every little sound, the floorboard creaking, the wind hitting the siding, the distant hum of a passing car, made me jump. I realized then that my trust in Chloe, which I had always assumed was as solid as the bedrock our house was built on, had developed a hairline fracture. And once a fracture like that appears, you can't just ignore it. You start wondering if the whole structure is compromised. The following morning, Chloe emerged from the bedroom with her eyes puffy and red, carrying a forced, fragile air of normalcy. She made coffee, acted as if our shouting match had been a bizarre, fever dream anomaly, and asked me what I wanted to do for lunch. She was performing the role of the devoted, slightly wounded wife, but something in her eyes was different. She was watching me, measuring my reactions, and for the first time in our marriage, I found myself doing the exact same thing to her. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask her why she brought up Jessica or why she had gotten so angry. I decided with a coldness that surprised even me to stay quiet. I watched. I started paying attention to the small, mundane details I had spent years completely ignoring. I noticed how she had suddenly become extremely protective of her smartphone, keeping it face down on the kitchen island, constantly adjusting the notification settings so the screen wouldn't light up when a message came in. I noticed the odd, erratic shift in her schedule. She began having late meetings at the travel agency, staying hours past her usual time, citing high-pressure projects and demanding new clients. I would sit in our living room in the evenings, pretending to work on my laptop, while the house felt increasingly silent and empty. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a man living alongside a woman who was technically his wife, but was becoming more of a ghost with every passing day. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that the movie night argument had simply brought out a temporary, defensive insecurity in her. But the more I looked, the more the little disparate facts began to arrange themselves into a singular, devastating picture. It was the lack of pattern that bothered me the most. She wasn't just being secretive, she was being erratic. One day, she was the incredibly attentive, loving wife who would surprise me with my favorite dinner and spend the entire night tucked against my side on the couch. The next, she was cold, distant, and seemingly lost in her own private world, responding to texts in the middle of dinner with a secretive, almost triumphant smile playing on her lips. That smile. That was the most painful part. I'd catch her across the room, watching her thumb scroll across her screen, and I'd see a flicker of an expression that didn't belong to the woman who lived with me. It was a smile of pure, unguarded joy, an expression of anticipation, of someone who was being thought of, someone who was being pursued, someone who was thriving in a secret world that I was absolutely excluded from. The seeds of doubt had firmly taken root. My curiosity, once a quiet, nagging whisper, was now a roaring, constant demand for the truth. But how do you confirm your worst suspicion without destroying your life? How do you ask your wife if she's sleeping with someone else when every instinct in your body is begging you to keep the illusion of your family intact? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in the dark. I was a man living on a ticking time bomb, and I had two options. I could keep my eyes closed and wait for the blast to eventually tear my life apart, or I could open my eyes and see exactly what was standing in front of me, even if the truth was the last thing I ever wanted to know. I chose the truth. I began to quietly, methodically investigate the woman I thought I knew. I stopped looking at our marriage as a permanent, unbreakable fact, and started viewing it as a mystery that I needed to solve. I began to look for the patterns in her lies, the holes in her stories, and the secret, invisible threads that were tying her to a life that had absolutely nothing to do with me. I knew that finding the truth would likely end our family. I knew that it would potentially shatter my children's world and leave me standing in the rubble of a decade of shared memories. But as I watched Chloe across the room, smiling at her phone with that secret, triumphant look, I knew there was no going back to the man I had been before the movie night. I was no longer the oblivious husband. I was an observer, waiting for the exact moment the mask would finally, inevitably, drop. And little did I know, the investigation would lead me to a truth far more powerful and devastating than anything I could have ever imagined in my worst, coldest nightmares. The hardest part about investigating the person you love isn't the mechanics of the search. It's the agonizing, contradictory psychology of the hunt. When you decide to start digging into your spouse's life, you become a detective desperately praying to be proven wrong. You are actively searching for the exact piece of evidence that will obliterate your world, hoping against hope that you will come up entirely empty-handed. You want to find nothing. You want to feel like a paranoid fool. You want to close your laptop, let out a massive sigh of relief, and go back to sleep next to your wife, secure in the knowledge that your family is safe. But intuition is a cruel, relentless master. My intuition told me that if I pulled at the loose thread Chloe had left dangling during our movie night argument, the entire tapestry of my marriage was going to unravel. My investigation began on a Tuesday night, about 2 weeks after our explosive fight over the film. Chloe had gone to bed early, claiming she had a migraine from a stressful day at the travel agency. I waited downstairs in the living room until the house was completely silent. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of her breathing echoing down the hall. I opened my laptop, the harsh blue light illuminating the dark room, and took a deep, steadying breath. I started with the easiest target, our shared cellular provider account. Since I handled all the household utility bills, I had the master login. I bypassed the dashboard and went straight into the detailed usage logs. I wasn't looking to read the content of her text messages. The carrier didn't provide that anyway. I was looking for patterns. I was looking for anomalies in the data. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the ghost in the machine. There was a specific unsaved phone number with a local area code that appeared on her usage log with staggering, terrifying frequency. It wasn't just a few texts a day. It was hundreds, but it was the timestamps that made my blood run ice cold. The messages would start around 8:00 a.m., the exact time she commuted to work. They would continue in a steady, heavy stream throughout the business day, tapering off perfectly around 5:30 p.m. right before she walked through our front door. But the most damning evidence was the late-night activity. On the nights she claimed she was asleep, or when I was working late on a commercial electrical job, the data logs showed long, uninterrupted phone calls to this exact same number. Calls that lasted 45 minutes, an hour, sometimes 2 hours, taking place at 1:00 or 2:00 in the morning. My hands began to shake as I scrolled backward through the billing cycles. I went back 1 month. The number was there, dominating her usage. I went back 3 months. It was still there. I went back 6 months, still there. The sheer volume of communication was breathtaking. This wasn't a sudden, fleeting crush or a temporary lapse in judgment. Whoever owned this number was a fundamental, permanent fixture in her daily routine. I needed more. A phone log proves inappropriate contact, but it doesn't map out a double life. I needed to know where she was physically going when she claimed she was at the office. I logged into our state's electronic toll collection portal. The EZ-Pass tag linked to her SUV. I pulled up my calendar and began cross-referencing her toll history with the days she had claimed to have late client dinners or emergency meetings at the agency over the past year. The lies materialized on the screen in cold, irrefutable data points. On a Thursday evening in September, when she had texted me saying she was stuck at the downtown office finalizing a massive corporate travel package, her toll tag registered her crossing the bridge out of the city, heading toward a cluster of high-end boutique hotels in the next county over. She hadn't returned across that bridge until nearly 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday in November when she supposedly had a networking mixer. Her car was parked in the long-term garage of an upscale resort 2 towns away. The physical toll of this discovery was overwhelming. I sat there in the dark, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck. I felt like the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath me, leaving me in a terrifying freefall. Every single excuse, every late night, every perfectly delivered apology for missing dinner. It was all a meticulously crafted script. But the absolute, soul-crushing gut punch didn't arrive until I pulled up the records for her annual girls' spa weekend. For the past 4 years, Chloe had taken a 4-day weekend every April to go to a wellness retreat with a few of her college friends. It was a tradition. I had never questioned it. I would stay home, watch the kids, and tell her to enjoy the massages and the wine. I searched the EZ-Pass logs for April of the previous year. Her car had never gone to the spa resort. It had traveled directly to a private, luxury lodge heavily secluded in the mountains, the exact opposite direction of where her friends supposedly were. I checked the phone records for that specific weekend. The communication with the mystery number vanished entirely for those 4 days, completely silent, only to resume the second she drove back into our city. They weren't texting because they didn't need to. They were together. I leaned back against the sofa, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes as the horrifying realization washed over me. I thought back to the movie night. I thought about same time next year. I thought about the fictional couple who lived separate lives but met up at the same romantic inn once a year to indulge in a passionate, secret romance. When Chloe was sitting on our couch, wiping tears from her eyes and fiercely defending the morality of those characters, she wasn't just sympathizing with a Hollywood script. She was watching a documentary of her own life. The movie wasn't fiction to her. It was validation. It was a reflection of the carefully constructed, deeply guarded double life she had been living right under my nose. No wonder she had exploded with such visceral rage when I called the characters cowards. I wasn't just insulting a fictional couple. I was entirely dismantling the twisted moral justification she had built to protect her own conscience. She believed that her affair was a profound, soulful connection because framing it as a tragic, complicated romance was the only way she could look at herself in the mirror every morning. I looked at the clock on my laptop. It was 3:45 a.m. I had spent the entire night excavating the ruins of my marriage. The sheer scale of the deception was paralyzing. Chloe wasn't just having a casual fling. She had maintained a parallel existence for years. She had divided her life into 2 completely separate realities: the safe, respectable, suburban reality with me and the kids, and the thrilling, passionate, secretive reality with a man whose identity was still hidden behind an unsaved phone number. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, plunging the living room back into total darkness. The woman sleeping upstairs was a stranger. The last half-decade of my life was a beautifully decorated stage play, and I was the only person in the theater who didn't know I was simply a supporting character in someone else's tragedy. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. I just sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how I was going to unmask the man on the other side of that phone number. I thought I had reached the absolute bottom of the rabbit hole. I thought the worst part of the nightmare was simply discovering the affair. But as the sun began to rise over the quiet suburban streets, bringing an end to my life as an oblivious husband, I had absolutely no idea that uncovering her lover's true identity was going to turn my personal heartbreak into a scandal that would make my blood run cold. The human mind is a terrifyingly resilient machine. When faced with an apocalyptic level of trauma, it doesn't immediately shut down. It shifts into a cold, hyper-focused survival mode. Sitting in the dark living room at 4:00 a.m., surrounded by the digital ruins of my marriage, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the unsaved phone number glaring back at me from my laptop screen. I had the raw data. I had the timelines, the EZ-Pass toll records, and the dates of the fake spa weekends. But data is just numbers on a spreadsheet. I needed a face. I needed to know exactly who was standing on the other side of my wife's carefully constructed stage play. My initial attempts to unmask the phantom were frustratingly useless. I spent the next 2 days diving into the murky waters of internet sleuthing. I ran the mystery number through every reverse lookup directory, public records database, and social media search bar I could find. It was a complete dead end. The number wasn't tied to a name, a residential address, or even a standard social media profile. It was registered to a vague, generic LLC with a P.O. box 3 states away. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just some guy from the local gym or a sleazy coworker from her travel agency. He was incredibly careful. He had resources, he had operational security, and he clearly had something massive to lose if this affair ever saw the light of day. That level of calculated secrecy meant I wasn't going to find my answers on a computer screen. If I wanted to see the ghost, I was going to have to hunt him in the real world. My opportunity arrived later that week. It was a Thursday morning, raining the kind of miserable, bone-chilling drizzle that makes the autumn air feel like ice. As Chloe was pouring her coffee in the kitchen, dressed in a sleek charcoal pantsuit and a string of pearls, she offered me that familiar, apologetic sigh. "Hey, Mark," she said, her voice perfectly pitched with just the right amount of manufactured exhaustion. "I am so sorry, but the agency is throwing a massive welcome dinner tonight for the new corporate accounts team. I'm practically required to be there. I probably won't be home until after 10. Can you hold down the fort with the kids?" I looked at her over the rim of my coffee mug. The sheer audacity of her performance was breathtaking. She didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice entirely level and supportive. "Don't worry about us. Have a good time at the dinner." "You're the best," she smiled, leaning over to kiss my cheek. The second her car pulled out of the driveway, I picked up my phone and called my brother, Dave. I told him I needed a massive favor, no questions asked. 30 minutes later, I had traded my recognizable, battered work truck for his incredibly generic dark blue sedan. I called my foreman at the electrical company, claimed a family emergency, and took the day off. At 4:30 p.m., I was parked in a crowded public lot across the street from Chloe's downtown travel agency, sitting low in the driver's seat of Dave's sedan. The rain was steadily drumming against the windshield, the wipers squeaking a rhythmic, tense beat. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Following your spouse is a surreal, out-of-body experience. You feel like a criminal in your own life. At exactly 5:15 p.m., her white SUV pulled out of the agency's parking garage. I slipped the sedan into drive and pulled into the flow of traffic, keeping 2 or 3 cars between us. She didn't head toward the local restaurant district where corporate dinners were typically held. Instead, she merged onto the interstate, heading toward the wealthiest, most exclusive district in the state capital. I gripped the steering wheel, my palms sweating despite the chill in the car. After 20 minutes of tense driving, she took an exit that led to an area of the city I rarely had a reason to visit. It was a district lined with towering, glass-fronted luxury high-rises, heavily guarded private clubs, and 5-star boutique hotels. She signaled right and pulled into the underground valet entrance of the Grandmont, a hyper-exclusive, incredibly discreet hotel where a single night cost more than my entire weekly paycheck as a commercial electrician. I couldn't follow her into the valet circle without blowing my cover. I illegally parked the sedan in a loading zone across the 4-lane street, killed the engine, and rolled the window down just enough to see clearly through the rain. I watched as the valet opened her door. Chloe stepped out, handed over her keys, and stood under the grand, illuminated awning of the hotel. She pulled out her phone, typed a quick message, and then slipped it back into her purse. She didn't go inside to the lobby. She was waiting. 5 minutes later, a massive, custom black Lincoln Navigator with deeply tinted windows glided silently up to the curb, pulling to a stop directly in front of her. It wasn't a standard Uber or a taxi. It was a private security vehicle. The driver, a large man in a dark suit, stepped out, walked around the front of the SUV, and opened the rear passenger door for her. But before Chloe stepped inside, a man leaned forward from the shadows of the backseat to greet her. He leaned out just enough into the glow of the hotel's awning lights for me to see his face clearly. The air instantly left my lungs. The world didn't just stop spinning, it completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. My hands began to shake so violently that I had to grab my own knees to steady myself. I recognized him. Everyone in the state recognized him. I had seen his face on a dozen billboards along the highway. I had seen him on the local evening news, shaking hands, cutting ribbons, and delivering passionate speeches about integrity and community. I had even seen his glossy campaign mailers stuffed inside my own mailbox, boldly proclaiming his platform of family first. It was Senator Arthur Vance. Chloe smiled, that radiant, blinding, unguarded smile I had seen her practicing on her phone in our living room, and she climbed into the back of the Lincoln Navigator with the senator. The heavy door slammed shut, completely sealing them inside their exclusive, untouchable world, and the SUV smoothly merged back into traffic, disappearing into the rainy evening. I sat frozen in the borrowed sedan, completely paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what I had just witnessed. This wasn't just an affair. It was an absolute systemic dismantling of my entire reality. The power imbalance was staggering, crushing me under its weight. I was a guy who wore steel-toed boots, carried a tool belt, and worried about the rising cost of groceries. I worked with my hands to provide a quiet, stable life in the suburbs. And my wife. My wife was playing the role of a high-society mistress to one of the most powerful, wealthy, and heavily protected political figures in our state. Senator Vance was a married man. He had a prominent, wealthy wife and 3 children who were regularly paraded out for his political campaigns. He had money, he had power, and he had an entire staff dedicated to keeping his secrets buried. As I sat there, hyperventilating in the damp chill of the car, the psychological devastation finally took hold. I realized why Chloe had defended the cheating couple in that movie with such terrifying passion. She didn't just feel guilty, she felt superior. She felt entitled. She was drunk on the glamour and the intoxicating power of being chosen by a man of Vance's status. To her, our marriage, our modest home, and my blue-collar life were just the boring, necessary props she used to maintain her public respectability, while her real life, her profound, soulful romance, was taking place in the back of blacked-out SUVs and luxury penthouses. How long had she been looking at me with secret, arrogant pity? How long had she been laughing at my utter blindness? The timeline of the E-ZPass records suddenly flashed through my mind with a violent, terrifying clarity. The secret trips to the mountain lodge, the unsaved number calling late into the night. I traced the dates backward. 4 years. She had been taking those girls' spa trips for 4 years. She had been seeing Senator Vance for at least that long. A cold, sickening terror suddenly eclipsed the heartbreak, spreading through my chest like a physical poison. Our youngest child, our little boy, had just turned 3 years old. I gripped the steering wheel, a desperate, animalistic panic rising in my throat. If she had been living this meticulously crafted double life with the senator for over 4 years, if she was capable of lying with such flawless, terrifying ease to my face every single day. Oh my God, I thought, the horrifying question echoing in the empty car. Are my kids even mine? The drive back to my house in my brother Dave's borrowed sedan was a blur of smeared headlights and relentless, freezing rain. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but my mind was entirely disconnected from the physical act of driving. I was trapped in a suffocating, terrifying loop of mental arithmetic. 4 years. I kept tracing the timeline of the E-ZPass logs backward in my head. The secret trips to the mountain lodge had started 4 years ago. The late-night phone calls with the unsaved number had been a steady, unbroken pattern for at least that long. Senator Arthur Vance hadn't just been a recent, thrilling mistake for my wife. He was a deeply embedded, parallel pillar of her adult life. And then, the most devastating variable of the entire equation slammed into the forefront of my mind. Our son, Zach, had just turned 3 years old. If you add 9 months of pregnancy to a 3-year-old's life, you land directly in the epicenter of Chloe's timeline with the senator. The math was brutally, undeniably precise. It lined up so perfectly that the realization hit me with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The sick, twisting terror in my gut completely eclipsed the heartbreak of the affair itself. Infidelity destroys a marriage, but paternity fraud destroys your very identity. It rewrites the foundational truth of your existence. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine of Dave's sedan, and just sat in the dark for a long time. The rain drummed against the roof of the car. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to walk into the house I had paid for, using the money I earned breaking my back as a commercial electrician, to look at a life that might be nothing more than a complete manufactured fiction. When I finally unlocked the front door, the house was quiet. Dave was sitting on the living room couch, watching a muted football game. He had come over to watch the kids so I could follow Chloe. Dave stood up the second I walked in. He took one look at my pale, hollow face, and the tension instantly hardened his features. "Mark," Dave said quietly, stepping forward, "did you catch her? Where did she go?" I couldn't even speak the words. Saying it out loud felt like making it permanently real. I just looked at my brother, gave a slow, devastated nod, and walked past him toward the stairs. "Thanks for watching them, Dave. I need to be alone right now. I'll call you tomorrow." Dave didn't press. He gave my shoulder a heavy, supportive squeeze and quietly let himself out the front door. I walked up the stairs, my boots feeling like they were made of lead. I didn't go to the master bedroom. I went straight down the hall to the kids' rooms. I checked on my 7-year-old daughter, Lily, first. She was sleeping soundly, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. Looking at Lily, I felt a solid, grounding wave of certainty. She was born long before the Easy Pass anomalies began. She had my eyes, my mother's smile, and my exact stubborn temperament. She was mine. Then I walked across the hall and gently pushed open the door to the nursery. The room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of a star-shaped nightlight. Zach was fast asleep in his toddler bed, the blankets kicked off his legs, his dark, curly hair plastered to his forehead. I walked over and knelt beside the bed, my knees popping in the quiet room. I stared at my son's face. I studied him with a frantic, desperate intensity that made me feel physically. For 3 years, I had looked at this boy and seen the absolute best parts of myself. I had taught him how to throw a ball, I had rocked him to sleep during thunderstorms, and I had proudly told everyone at the electrical union that he was my little shadow. But now, looking at the slope of his jaw, the shape of his nose, the curl of his dark hair, the toxic seed of doubt began to violently bloom. Did he look like me? Or did he look like the polished, wealthy, untouchable man I had just seen pulling Chloe into the back of a blacked-out Lincoln Navigator? "Are you even mine?" The question echoed in the quiet nursery, a dark, insidious poison seeping into the deepest corners of my heart. I rested my forehead against the wooden railing of his bed, squeezing my eyes shut as a single, silent tear finally broke free. Whether he shared my DNA or not, I loved this little boy with a ferocity that defied logic. He was my son. But the deception, the idea that my wife had potentially used me to raise another man's child to protect her own reputation, was a violation so profound it bordered on evil. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't confront Chloe the next morning. Instead, I became a ghost haunting my own house. I operated on a cold, mechanical autopilot. When Chloe came home from her corporate dinner, bubbling with fake apologies and a rehearsed story about boring clients, I smiled, told her I was glad she was home, and went to work. I was buying time. You do not detonate a nuclear bomb inside your own home without first understanding the exact blast radius. During my lunch break the next day, sitting in my work truck outside a construction site, I pulled out my phone and ordered 2 highly rated, legally admissible DNA paternity testing kits. To ensure Chloe wouldn't intercept the package at our front door, I had them overnighted to a secure P.O. box I rented down the street from my job site. The kits arrived 48 hours later. They were stark, clinical, and terrifying. 2 small cardboard boxes containing sterile buccal swabs, biohazard bags, and prepaid overnight mailing envelopes. That evening, while Chloe was upstairs taking a shower, I sat Zach up on the kitchen counter. "All right, buddy," I said, forcing a bright, playful smile onto my face. "We're going to play a quick game. Can you open your mouth really wide like a roaring lion for Daddy?" "Roar," Zach giggled, opening his mouth and showing off his tiny teeth. My hands trembled slightly as I took the sterile cotton swab from its plastic casing. "Good job. Now let Daddy brush your cheek real quick. Tickle, tickle, tickle." I rubbed the swab against the inside of his cheek for the required 20 seconds. Zach laughed, completely innocent, entirely unaware of the devastating gravity of the game we were playing. I placed the swab carefully into the biohazard envelope, sealed it, and then quickly swabbed my own cheek, dropping it into the corresponding bag. I took the completed kits, placed them inside the prepaid mailer, and walked out to the garage. I stood under the harsh fluorescent bulb of my workbench, holding the thick envelope. All I had to do was drop it into a FedEx box. Within a week, a sterile, printed piece of paper would arrive in my inbox, and the agonizing question burning a hole in my sanity would be answered. But as I looked at the envelope, a sudden, paralyzing wave of terror completely locked my muscles in place. If I mailed that envelope, I could never unknow the truth. But more importantly, the truth carried legal ramifications that absolutely terrified me. I am a blue-collar commercial electrician. I make an honest living, but I don't have endless resources. Senator Arthur Vance, on the other hand, is a multimillionaire. He has a law degree, deep political connections, high-powered fixers, and a vested interest in protecting his public image. If the test came back negative, if Zach was truly the senator's biological son, what would happen when I finally confronted Chloe and filed for divorce? Would she run to Vance? Would they use their endless wealth and power to completely destroy me in family court? If Vance was the biological father, would he demand custody just to keep Chloe quiet and satisfied? The American legal system is a terrifying machine when you are up against the political elite. I realized with a sickening clarity that if I pulled this pin right now, I could very well lose the little boy sleeping in the nursery upstairs. I could end up bankrupt, divorced, and stripped of my rights to a son I had raised since his first breath. I couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until I had an airtight legal strategy, a ruthless attorney, and my own financial ducks perfectly in a row. I walked over to the corner of the garage where I kept a heavy iron, fireproof safe bolted to the concrete floor. It was where we kept our passports, the deed to the house, and our birth certificates. I spun the combination dial, the heavy metallic clicks echoing in the quiet garage, and pulled the heavy door open. I looked at the prepaid FedEx envelope one last time. It felt like I was holding a live grenade. I placed the sealed envelope into the back of the iron safe, shut the door, and locked it. I wouldn't mail it. Not today. I would wait, I would prepare, and I would protect my children at all costs before I let the truth burn our world to the ground. I didn't know it at the time, but I would never actually mail those swabs. Because before I could ever build the courage or the legal armor to confront my wife, the universe was going to violently intervene, delivering a sudden, catastrophic tragedy that would make the DNA tests entirely irrelevant and change the trajectory of our lives forever. For 3 agonizing weeks, I lived in a state of suspended animation. The heavy iron safe in the corner of my garage sat there like a gravitational anomaly, pulling at my thoughts every single hour of the day. Inside it sat the sealed FedEx envelope containing the DNA swabs, the undeniable biological truth of my son's parenthood. But as the days bled into one another, I kept the combination dial firmly locked. I was paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying logistics of what lay ahead. You do not declare war on a wealthy, highly protected politician without a fortress of your own, and I was just a blue-collar electrician trying to figure out how to pay for a ruthless divorce attorney without tipping off my wife. So I played the part. I smiled at Chloe across the dinner table. I asked her about her day at the travel agency. I listened to her complain about non-existent clients, knowing full well she was simply managing the exhaustion of her double life. It was a sickening, Oscar-worthy performance on both our parts. I was quietly, meticulously gathering my financial documents, researching law firms on my lunch breaks, and preparing for the explosive confrontation that would inevitably burn our family to the ground. I was bracing for a war. I had absolutely no idea that the universe was about to violently intervene and end the conflict before a single shot was ever fired. It happened on a Tuesday in early December. The morning was entirely, painfully ordinary. A heavy frost had settled over the suburbs, coating the windshields of the cars in our driveway. Chloe was standing in the kitchen, wearing a thick wool sweater, pouring cereal for Lily and Zach. I stood by the counter, drinking my coffee out of a travel mug, wearing my heavy canvas work jacket. "I have a meeting with the regional directors across town today," Chloe said casually, wiping a smudge of milk off Zach's chin. "I'll be driving on the interstate most of the afternoon. Can you pick Lily up from soccer practice?" "Yeah, I've got it," I replied, my voice perfectly level. In the back of my mind, I was already calculating her route, wondering if the regional directors were just another code word for the blacked-out Lincoln Navigator and Senator Vance. "Drive safe," she said, giving me a quick, practiced peck on the cheek as I headed for the door. "You too," I answered. I went to work. My crew was assigned to a massive, unfinished commercial warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and I spent the first half of the day 60 feet in the air on a scissor lift, running heavy conduit pipes along the steel rafters. The physical, exhausting nature of the labor was the only thing that kept me grounded. Up there, surrounded by the deafening roar of power drills and the shouting of the foremen, I didn't have to think about the safe in my garage. At 2:15 p.m., I had just lowered the lift to grab a new spool of wire when my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my heavy jacket pocket. I pulled off my leather work glove and looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, but the caller ID flagged it as originating from the State Highway Patrol. A strange, icy prickle of unease washed over the back of my neck. I stepped away from the noise of the construction crew and answered. "Hello." "Is this Mark?" A woman's voice asked. It was a calm, heavily modulated clinical voice, the kind of voice trained to deliver devastating news without inflection. "Yes, speaking." "Mark, my name is Officer Reynolds with the State Highway Patrol. I'm calling regarding your wife, Chloe. Are you currently in a safe place to talk?" The world around me seemed to instantly drop in volume. The hammering, the drills, the shouting, it all faded into a dull, distant static. "Yes, what happened? Is she okay?" "Mark, there was a multi-vehicle collision on the southbound interstate about an hour ago," the officer said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave into a register of profound sympathy. "A commercial logging truck lost a tire, crossed the concrete median, and struck oncoming traffic. Your wife's SUV was involved." "Okay," I stammered, my brain struggling to catch up to the words. "Okay, which hospital is she at? I can leave work right now." There was a heavy, terrible pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that fundamentally permanently alters the trajectory of your life. "Mark, I am so incredibly sorry," Officer Reynolds said softly. "She didn't make it. Paramedics pronounced her at the scene. We need you to come down to Mercy General Hospital to speak with the medical examiner and formally identify." I didn't hear the rest of the sentence. The phone slipped slightly in my grip. My knees simply ceased to function, and I sank down onto a stack of wooden pallets, the rough wood catching the fabric of my jeans. The breath completely left my lungs, replaced by a suffocating, crushing vacuum. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. My foreman had to drive me, taking the keys out of my shaking hands. The next few hours were a surreal, nightmarish blur of sterile white hallways, sympathetic nurses, and the heavy smell of antiseptic. I was ushered into a small, private grieving room with beige walls and a box of tissues on a cheap laminate table. The doctor walked in, his face drawn and exhausted, and explained the sheer randomness of the tragedy. It had nothing to do with her secret life. She hadn't been with the senator. She hadn't been texting. She was simply driving down the interstate when a massive, unavoidable mechanical failure from a truck in the opposite lane caused a catastrophic pileup. It was instantaneous. She hadn't suffered. Then came the agonizing process of receiving her personal effects. A police officer handed me a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it was her wedding ring, a silver necklace, and the crushed, completely shattered remains of her smartphone. The very device that held the keys to her betrayal, the gateway to her double life, permanently destroyed by the impact. As I sat alone in that quiet hospital room, holding the plastic bag, I experienced the most complex, terrifying collision of emotions a human being can possibly endure. I was completely shattered. I was weeping openly, my chest heaving with the raw, guttural agony of a man who had just lost his partner of a decade. Because despite the lies, despite the profound disrespect and the chilling double life she had built, she was still the mother of my children. She was still the woman I had built a home with. But beneath the crushing weight of the grief, there was a dark, confusing, and intensely isolating realization taking hold. The war was over. The divorce, the custody battle, the explosive confrontation, none of it was going to happen. Chloe had taken the truth with her into the void. She would never face the consequences of her actions. I would never get the chance to look her in the eye and demand to know why I wasn't enough, or how she could possibly look at our son and lie to my face. The stage play had ended abruptly mid-scene, and the curtain had violently dropped. I walked out of the hospital as the sun was setting, the cold winter air biting at my tear-stained face. I was now a widower. I had to go home, sit my 7-year-old daughter and my 3-year-old son down on the living room couch, and break their hearts. I had to watch their entire world collapse, and I had to be the strong, steady pillar to hold them upright. And I had to do it all while carrying a radioactive, toxic secret that I could never, ever share with anyone. The affair was dead, but the ghost remained. And as I drove back to my quiet, suburban home, I realized that the heavy iron safe in the garage was no longer just a storage box. It was a tomb, holding the last terrifying remnants of a life that had completely ceased to exist. The funeral was a surreal, deeply agonizing theater production, and I was forced to play the lead role of the devastated, broken-hearted husband. As I stood under a dark canopy in the freezing December rain, watching Chloe's casket being lowered into the earth, I was surrounded by hundreds of people. Her colleagues from the travel agency, our neighbors, The parents from Lily's soccer team and our old friends, Bob and Maria, were all there. They lined up in a seemingly endless procession of black coats and umbrellas, shaking my hand, pulling me into tight hugs, and weeping openly. Every single one of them offered some variation of the exact same hollow comfort. She was such a wonderful woman. She loved you and the kids so incredibly much. You were her whole world. With every sympathetic whisper, I had to swallow a sickening, rising tide of bile. I simply nodded, kept my face perfectly stoic, and thanked them for coming. I couldn't tell them the truth. I couldn't scream that the woman they were mourning was a carefully constructed fiction, a flawless actress who had spent the last 4 years treating our family as a convenient, boring waiting room between her passionate encounters at luxury boutique hotels. I had to protect my children, Lily and Zach, who were standing right beside me, clutching my hands, completely shattered by the loss of their mother. They didn't deserve to have their grief poisoned by her sins. But as my eyes scanned the perimeter of the cemetery, looking past the weeping faces of our friends and family, I was quietly, frantically searching for him. I half expected to see a blacked-out Lincoln Navigator idling on the edge of the graveyard. I half expected Senator Arthur Vance to show up, hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses, to pay his final, tragic respects to the woman he had shared a parallel life with for half a decade. He never came. There were no anonymous flower arrangements. There were no discreet condolence cards. The second Chloe's SUV was crushed on that interstate, Senator Vance completely erased her from his existence. He was a man of immense power, wealth, and public standing, and men like that do not risk their empires for dead mistresses. To him, Chloe was just a liability that the universe had conveniently disposed of before she could ever become a scandal. The profound, suffocating injustice of it all didn't truly hit me until about 2 months after the funeral. The dead of winter had settled over the city, and our house was trapped in a heavy, permanent silence. I was barely holding it together, running on coffee and 3 hours of sleep a night. I was a single father navigating the traumatizing wreckage of suddenly losing a spouse. I was waking up at 2:00 a.m. to comfort Zach when he cried out for his mother. I was holding Lily while she sobbed into my chest because she didn't understand why Mommy wasn't there to help her with her math homework. I was drowning under the weight of grocery shopping, laundry, utility bills, and the sheer, exhausting logistics of keeping 2 heartbroken children feeling safe and loved. And while my family was entirely broken, fighting tooth and nail just to survive the week, Senator Arthur Vance was absolutely thriving. It was an election year, and his face was inescapable. One evening, after I finally got the kids to sleep, I collapsed onto the living room sofa and turned on the local news just to have some background noise. The screen immediately flashed to a press conference being held on the steps of the state capitol building. There he was, Senator Vance, wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, standing behind a podium adorned with the state seal. His beautiful, aristocratic wife was standing dutifully by his side, smiling with practiced political perfection. My blood ran ice cold as I turned up the volume. The tragedy we witnessed on the southbound interstate this past December broke the hearts of our entire community, Senator Vance boomed, his voice echoing with a rich, manufactured empathy that made me feel physically ill. He was actually referencing the crash that killed Chloe. Families were shattered. Innocent lives were stolen. And that is exactly why today I am proud to introduce the Comprehensive Highway Safety and Infrastructure Bill. We must protect our families. We must put the safety of our citizens first. I am making a promise to every husband, wife, and child in this state. I will not stop fighting for you. I sat on the couch, completely paralyzed, staring at the television screen. He wasn't just surviving the fallout of his illicit affair. He was actively weaponizing the tragic death of the woman he had been sleeping with to score political points. He was riding a massive, soaring wave of public sympathy, positioning himself as the ultimate champion of family values, all while standing on the grave of my ruined marriage. The voters were eating it up. The news anchors praised his compassionate leadership. His poll numbers skyrocketed. I picked up my heavy ceramic coffee mug and violently hurled it across the room. It smashed against the brick fireplace, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces, the cold coffee staining the hearth. I dropped my head into my hands and let out a raw, agonizing scream of pure frustration. It was the most profound, sickening injustice I had ever witnessed. The universe had allowed the architect of my wife's deception to walk away completely unscathed, wrapped in a cloak of untouchable power, while I was left sitting in a quiet, dark house, sweeping up broken ceramics and paying the ultimate emotional price. My mind immediately darted to the garage. I thought about the heavy iron safe bolted to the concrete floor. Inside it sat the sealed FedEx envelope containing the DNA swabs I had taken from Zach and myself weeks before the accident. In that moment of blistering, blinding rage, I wanted nothing more than to walk out to the garage, rip that safe open, and mail the envelope. I wanted to prove that Zach was his. I wanted to take the results, march directly to the local news stations, and detonate a nuclear bomb right in the middle of Senator Vance's pristine family first re-election campaign. I wanted to watch his empire burn. I wanted to see the smug, empathetic smile wiped off his face as the entire state learned exactly who he was and what he had been doing in the back of those luxury SUVs. I stood up from the couch, my hands trembling with adrenaline, and walked through the kitchen toward the heavy door that led to the garage. I grabbed the doorknob. The cold metal bit into my palm, but as I stood there preparing to unleash my vengeance, the floorboards above my head creaked. I paused, listening. A few seconds later, the soft, hesitant patter of little feet echoed down the wooden stairs. I let go of the garage doorknob and stepped back into the hallway. Zach was standing at the bottom of the staircase, wearing his oversized superhero pajamas, clutching his favorite blanket. His big, dark eyes were wide and slightly glassy with sleep. He looked so incredibly small, so entirely fragile in the vast, empty house. "Daddy," he whispered, his lower lip quivering slightly. I had a bad dream. The towering, blinding rage that had just consumed me instantly evaporated, replaced by a devastating, overwhelming wave of protective love. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor and opened my arms. "Come here, buddy," I said softly, my voice cracking. Zach ran across the hall and threw his little arms around my neck, burying his face in the crook of my shoulder. I wrapped my arms tightly around his small body, resting my chin on the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his baby shampoo. I held him close, rocking him gently back and forth until his breathing steadied and the fear left his tiny frame. As I knelt there holding my son, the cold, terrifying reality of my situation finally settled over me. If I mailed those swabs, if I engaged in a scorched earth war against a powerful, wealthy politician, I wouldn't just be destroying Arthur Vance. I would be destroying Zach. I would be branding this innocent, beautiful little boy as the illegitimate byproduct of a scandalous political affair. I would subject him to a brutal, public media circus. And worst of all, I would risk opening a legal door that could allow Vance to claim custody of him. A man who would use a tragic accident to score polling points wouldn't hesitate to drag a blue-collar electrician through family court if he thought playing the devoted biological father would somehow mitigate the scandal. I could lose him. I could actually lose my son. "I've got you, Zach," I whispered into his hair, tears silently spilling over my cheeks. "Daddy's right here, you're safe." "I love you, Daddy," he mumbled sleepily into my shirt. That was it. That was the only truth that mattered. I picked my son up, carried him back upstairs, and tucked him securely into his bed. I kissed his forehead, turned on his star-shaped nightlight, and closed the door. I walked back downstairs, but I didn't go into the garage. I walked past the heavy door, grabbed a broom, and began sweeping up the shattered pieces of the coffee mug. The political injustice was sickening, and the secret would haunt me for the rest of my life, but I was making my choice. I was choosing to be a father, not an avenger. I was choosing the quiet, beautiful reality of the boy who called me daddy over the toxic, biological truth locked inside a cold iron safe. Senator Vance could have his election, his podium, and his pathetic manufactured legacy. I was keeping the only thing that actually had any real value. The first 6 months after the funeral were a masterclass in functional dissociation. When you become a single parent overnight, especially under the heavy, suffocating shadow of sudden tragedy, you simply do not have the luxury of falling apart. You cannot lock yourself in a dark room and surrender to the grief, because there are school lunches to pack, shoelaces to tie, and nightmares to chase away. You become a machine entirely fueled by caffeine, adrenaline, and a desperate primal need to shield your children from the harshness of the world. Winter thawed into a wet, muddy spring, and my life settled into an endless, exhausting loop of logistics. My alarm would go off at 4:30 a.m. I would drink a cup of black coffee in the silent kitchen, pack Lily's backpack, prep Zach's daycare bag, and then wake them up with a cheerful, manufactured smile that required every ounce of my acting ability to maintain. I worked my grueling shifts as a commercial electrician, relying on my brother Dave to help with afternoon pickups, and then I would come home to cook dinner, supervise homework, and manage the chaotic bedtime routines. I avoided the television. I actively avoided the local news, terrified of seeing Senator Arthur Vance's face smiling back at me from a campaign rally. The heavy iron safe in my garage, holding the unmailed DNA swabs, remained entirely untouched. I was burying my trauma under a mountain of daily responsibilities, convinced that if I just kept moving, if I just kept my head down and focused solely on Lily and Zach, the ghosts of Chloe's double life would eventually fade away. But while I was meticulously managing the emotional wreckage at home, a completely different kind of machinery was slowly, quietly turning in the background. The fatal accident on the interstate hadn't just been a tragic stroke of bad luck. The State Highway Patrol's investigation revealed that the commercial logging truck that crossed the median had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure due to gross, documented negligence on the part of the trucking company. They had skipped mandatory maintenance checks, ignored worn brake lines, and falsified safety logs to keep their drivers on the road. Because of their blinding greed, an innocent woman's SUV was crushed. I hadn't initiated the lawsuit. I didn't have the mental bandwidth to navigate a massive legal battle. But the trucking company's corporate insurance providers, absolutely terrified of a highly public multi-million-dollar wrongful death trial that they were guaranteed to lose, initiated the process themselves. They wanted to settle quickly, quietly, and entirely out of court. I handed the paperwork over to a highly recommended personal injury attorney, gave him explicit instructions to keep me out of the boardroom negotiations, and told him to call me only when it was over. That call finally came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late July. I took off my hard hat, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and answered the phone on the noisy construction site. My attorney's voice was remarkably quiet, carrying a tone of solemn finality. He told me that the corporate insurance executives had officially capitulated. The settlement had been finalized, the judge had signed off on the wrongful death disbursements, and the funds had cleared the trust account. He asked me to come down to his office to sign the final release forms and collect the check. Sitting in the plush, air-conditioned conference room of the downtown law firm an hour later, I felt entirely out of place in my dusty work boots and canvas jacket. My attorney slid a manila folder across the polished mahogany table. Inside was a single printed piece of paper. It was the settlement check. I stared at the string of numbers printed across the center of the page, and the air completely left my lungs. It was an astronomical, surreal amount of money. It was the kind of multi-million-dollar wealth that a blue-collar electrician like me couldn't even conceptualize. It was more money than I could make in 5 lifetimes of wiring commercial warehouses. But as I looked at the check, I didn't feel a sudden rush of joy or relief. I felt a cold, sickening heaviness settle in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't lottery winnings. It was blood money. It was the calculated financial value that a corporate actuary had assigned to the abrupt, violent end of my marriage. And knowing the dark, toxic truth about Chloe's double life, knowing about Senator Vance, the luxury hotels, and the lies, made the money feel entirely tainted. It felt like a final, mocking payout from a universe that had allowed a politician to walk away clean while I was left holding the bag. I signed the release forms, shook the attorney's hand, and walked out to my battered work truck. I sat behind the steering wheel in the parking garage for a long time, the manila folder resting on the passenger seat. What does a betrayed, grieving man do with that kind of money? The temptation to spiral into bitterness was incredibly strong. I could quit my job immediately. I could buy a massive house, a sports car, and drown my lingering anger in top-shelf bourbon on a beach somewhere. I could use the money to hire private investigators, dig up every dirty secret Arthur Vance had ever buried, and fund a relentless, scorched-earth crusade to destroy his political empire. I finally had the financial ammunition to fight a war I had previously been too poor to wage. But then, my eyes drifted down to the floorboard of my truck. Resting near the gearshift was a small, brightly colored plastic dinosaur that Zach had dropped that morning. Taped to the dashboard was a crayon drawing Lily had made for me, depicting our family as 3 smiling stick figures standing under a yellow sun. I picked up the plastic dinosaur and rolled it over in my calloused hands. The anger that had been simmering in my chest for months suddenly evaporated, replaced by a fierce, undeniable clarity. This money wasn't a weapon. It was a shield. When I had stood in my garage holding those DNA tests months ago, my greatest paralyzing fear was my own vulnerability. I had been terrified that Senator Vance's wealth and power could easily crush me in family court. I had been terrified of losing my children because I couldn't afford to protect them against a high-profile legal machine. Now, the universe had just handed me the ultimate impenetrable armor. I didn't drive to my local credit union to deposit the check. I drove directly to the most reputable, high-end wealth management firm in the city. I walked into the lobby, asked for a senior fiduciary planner, and refused to leave until I was sitting in an office. I don't want to invest in the stock market, I don't want to buy real estate, and I don't want a high-yield portfolio for myself, I told the impeccably dressed financial advisor, sliding the manila folder across his desk. I want to build a fortress. I spent the next 3 hours outlining exactly what I wanted. We structured 2 massive, ironclad, irrevocable trust funds, one for Lily and one for Zach. I took the vast majority of the settlement and locked it away permanently. The trusts were meticulously designed so that the funds could only be accessed for their education, their health care, and eventually the down payments on their first homes. I made sure the legal wording was absolutely bulletproof. I structured it so that no one could ever touch that money. Not a future spouse, not a sleazy politician trying to claim biological rights, and not even myself should I ever face financial ruin. The money belonged entirely, safely, and permanently to my children. I paid off the remaining mortgage on my house, set aside a modest emergency fund to replace my lost dual income, and walled off the rest. When the advisor finally printed the trust documents, and I signed my name at the bottom of the pages, a profound, physical shift occurred inside my body. The suffocating weight I had been carrying on my chest since the night of the movie argument finally lifted. I walked out of the financial firm and stepped into the warm July evening. The city hummed around me, alive and vibrant. For the very first time in almost a year, I felt entirely safe. Senator Vance could keep his fake political legacy. He could keep his secrets. I didn't care anymore because he had absolutely no power over me or my family. I had secured my children's futures, guaranteed their college educations, and built an invisible, unbreakable wall around their lives. I got back into my truck, started the engine, and smiled. I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable. I had navigated the darkness of grief and the terrifying labyrinth of single fatherhood, and I had emerged on the other side as a protector. The rebuild of my family's foundation was officially complete. Now it was finally time to figure out how to rebuild the man who was leading them, and to open myself up to the possibility of a life that wasn't defined by the ghosts of the past. They say that time heals all wounds, but I've always found that phrase to be a bit of an oversimplification. Time doesn't heal the wound. It just thickens the scar tissue around it so that it stops hurting every single time you move. 2 full years passed after the settlement check was locked away into those ironclad trust funds. Over those 24 months, my life settled into a steady, reliable rhythm. I was promoted to a senior foreman position at the electrical company, which allowed me to work more predictable hours. Lily was thriving in the 4th grade, and Zach had grown into a wildly energetic, constantly curious 5-year-old. We were surviving. We had our routines, our Friday night pizza traditions, and a quiet, peaceful home. But surviving is not the same thing as truly living. Once the dust of the tragedy had fully settled, and the crushing daily panic of single fatherhood had smoothed out into a manageable routine, I began to notice the profound, echoing silence in the house after 8:00 p.m. when the kids were finally tucked into bed and the television was switched off. I was left entirely alone with my thoughts. I had successfully built an impenetrable financial and emotional fortress to protect my children, but in doing so, I had completely walled myself off from the world. I hadn't been on a date. I hadn't looked at another woman. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of Chloe's deception had left me with a deeply ingrained hypervigilance. The idea of trusting someone enough to let them into our fragile sanctuary felt completely impossible. But the universe has an incredibly ironic, deeply poetic sense of humor. It happened on a crisp, brilliant Saturday morning in mid-October. The air was biting and smelled of wood smoke and dried leaves. I had packed Lily and Zach into my truck and driven them to a massive community autumn festival held at the county fairgrounds. It was exactly the kind of wholesome, chaotic suburban event that Chloe used to despise, but the kids absolutely loved it. We had spent the last 2 hours navigating corn mazes, drinking hot apple cider, and searching for the absolute perfect pumpkins to carve for Halloween. I was standing near a wooden display crate, watching Zach aggressively debate the structural integrity of a deeply lopsided gourd, when a voice called out from behind me. "Mark. Mark, is that you?" I turned around, pulling my hands out of my jacket pockets. Standing a few feet away, holding 2 cups of coffee, was a woman wearing a heavy knit sweater and a worn-in denim jacket. She had warm, crinkling eyes, an easy, unpretentious smile, and a messy bun of dark hair escaping from beneath a knitted beanie. For a fraction of a second, my brain scrambled to place her. She was a ghost from a completely different lifetime, a face I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. It was Jessica. My old high school and early college girlfriend. The immediate, dizzying irony of the moment hit me with the force of a freight train. My mind instantly flashed back to that fateful Friday night in my living room, nearly 3 years ago. I heard Chloe's furious, defensive voice echoing in my memory. "This isn't about you and your precious old high school fling, Jessica." Chloe had weaponized Jessica's name out of thin air to deflect from her own sickening guilt. She had used a woman I hadn't thought about in 10 years as a smokescreen to protect her illicit, high-profile double life with Senator Vance. And now, by some bizarre, beautifully orchestrated twist of fate, that exact same woman was standing directly in front of me in the middle of a pumpkin patch. "Jessica." I blinked, genuinely stunned. "Wow, it's been a really long time." "It has," she smiled, her eyes softening with a genuine, grounded warmth. She walked over, mindful of the kids. "I moved back to town about 6 months ago to be closer to my parents. I heard about Chloe and the accident. Mark, I am so incredibly sorry for your loss. I can't even imagine what you've been through." There was no awkwardness, no forced, manufactured sympathy like the kind I had endured at the funeral. It was just an authentic, decent human being offering condolences to someone she used to care about. We stood there and talked for 20 minutes while the kids debated their pumpkin choices. I learned that she was an elementary school teacher, that she had gone through an amicable but sad divorce a few years prior, and that she was currently navigating the strange waters of starting over in her hometown. There was no pretense with her. She didn't have a carefully curated mask, she didn't check her phone every 30 seconds, and she didn't possess any of the exhausting aristocratic ambitions that had consumed my late wife. When it was time to wrangle the kids and head toward the checkout line, I did something that surprised me more than anyone. I pulled out my phone. "Would you want to grab a cup of coffee sometime?" I asked, suddenly feeling like a nervous teenager again. Just catch up as adults. Jessica beamed, a real radiant smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I would really love that, Mark." That cup of coffee turned into a 3-hour dinner the following Thursday night, while my brother Dave watched the kids. Sitting across from Jessica in a quiet, dimly lit Italian restaurant, I experienced a sensation I hadn't felt in over half a decade. I felt completely safe. I didn't dump the horrific, toxic truth of Senator Vance and the DNA tests onto the table. That burden was mine to carry. But I was radically honest about where I was in life. I told her about the paralyzing fear of being a single dad, the exhaustion, and the heavy walls I had built around my heart. I told her I was terrified of opening up again. Jessica just listened. She didn't offer empty platitudes, and she didn't try to fix me. She just reached across the table, rested her hand over mine, and said, "You don't have to take the walls down all at once, Mark. We can just sit in the courtyard for a while." That dinner was the spark that reignited my life. Over the next 6 months, Jessica and I built something so fundamentally different from my marriage to Chloe that it felt like breathing pure oxygen after years of suffocating in smog. Our relationship wasn't built on grand, expensive gestures, luxury hotels, or maintaining a flawless public image. It was built in the quiet, mundane trenches of real life. Integrating her into my children's lives was the most terrifying step, but Jessica handled it with a grace that still brings tears to my eyes. Because she was a teacher, she naturally understood the fragile psychology of children who had lost their mother. She didn't come into our house trying to play the role of a replacement parent. She came in as a friend. She would sit on the living room floor and build massive Lego towers with Zach. She would patiently help Lily navigate the frustrating complexities of 4th-grade fractions. She filled our home with an authentic, joyful noise that easily overpowered the lingering silence. The kids didn't just like her. They absolutely adored her. And as I watched her laugh with my daughter across the kitchen island, I realized that the heavy, protective armor I had been wearing for years was quietly falling away. But the most profound healing occurred when the house finally went quiet. With Chloe, our physical intimacy had become a cold, transactional routine, a chore she performed to maintain her perfect wife cover story while she saved her true passion for the back of a Lincoln Navigator. For years, I had internalized that rejection, allowing it to poison my self-worth. With Jessica, it was a complete revelation. Our nights together behind the closed door of the master bedroom were intensely passionate, profoundly vulnerable, and fiercely loving. There were no ghosts in the bed. There were no secret, unsaved phone numbers vibrating on the nightstand. When she looked at me, she wasn't looking past me to someone better, richer, or more powerful. She saw me. She saw the blue-collar electrician, the exhausted father, the scarred widower, and she loved every single piece of it without hesitation. I was finally living a life steeped entirely in truth. I had a partner who was standing firmly on my team, not secretly auditioning for a different one. The irony of it all was almost too perfect to articulate. Chloe had maliciously brought up Jessica's name to make me feel small, to distract me from her own monstrous betrayal. But in the end, her defensive, guilty deflection had simply foreshadowed my salvation. By the time our one-year anniversary rolled around, I knew exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to live in the house I had shared with Chloe anymore. The walls still held the faint, lingering memories of her lies, and the garage still held the heavy iron safe. It was time for a completely fresh start. It was time to finally close the door on the tragedy and open a brand new chapter with the woman who had brought the light back into my world. When you finally decide to close a dark chapter of your life, you realize just how much physical space your trauma has been occupying. As my relationship with Jessica deepened into a profound, unshakable partnership, the house I had shared with Chloe began to feel like a museum dedicated to a stranger. Everywhere I looked, I saw the carefully curated props of her double life. I saw the kitchen island where she had lied to me about corporate dinners. I saw the living room sofa where she had furiously defended the cheating characters in that movie. The house was beautiful, but its foundation was built on a terrifying illusion. I didn't want to bring Jessica into a space haunted by those ghosts, and honestly, I didn't want to raise my children inside a monument to their mother's deception. So I decided to purge it all. I put the house on the market. We didn't just sell the property. We hired an estate liquidator and auctioned off nearly every piece of furniture, decor, and artwork inside it. It was an incredibly cathartic, almost surreal experience. I stood in the driveway on a brisk Saturday morning and watched strangers carry away the expensive dining table Chloe had picked out, the rugs she had meticulously color-coordinated, and the massive bed where she used to lie next to me while texting Senator Vance. With every item that went into the back of a moving truck, my chest felt a little lighter. I was literally auctioning off the stage play piece by piece until nothing was left but empty rooms and echoes. Jessica offered us her home. It was a spacious, slightly older but beautifully maintained house in a quiet neighborhood with giant oak trees in the front yard. The kids were absolutely thrilled beyond belief. We took them furniture shopping, and they got to pick out entirely new bedroom sets. Lily chose a bright, vibrant purple theme, and Zach picked out a bed shaped like a race car. Moving day was chaotic, loud, and filled with the kind of messy, genuine laughter that had been entirely absent from my life for years. But as I was moving the last of my personal belongings into Jessica's garage, I found myself standing face to face with the final, heaviest piece of my past, the iron fireproof safe. I had moved it myself using a heavy-duty hand truck, sliding it into the corner of Jessica's garage. I stood there wiping the sweat from my brow, staring at the combination dial. I hadn't opened it since the night I locked the DNA paternity tests inside, weeks before Chloe's fatal accident. For over 2 years, that sealed FedEx envelope had been sitting in the dark, patiently waiting to deliver the biological truth of my son's existence. My fingers hovered over the dial. The house inside was bustling with activity. I could hear Jessica in the kitchen, laughing as she tried to organize the pantry, and I could hear the faint sound of a cartoon playing on the living room television. I spun the dial. Click, click, click. I pulled the heavy iron door open. There it was, resting on top of our birth certificates and passports. The white cardboard FedEx mailer containing the buccal swabs from my cheek and Zach's cheek. I reached in and pulled it out. I held the envelope in both hands. It felt incredibly light, yet it possessed the power to completely shatter my reality. All I had to do was walk down the street to the drop box, mail it, and wait 5 days. I would finally know with absolute scientific certainty if my son was a product of my marriage or a biological consequence of Senator Arthur Vance's high-profile affair. The burning curiosity that had once driven me to the edge of madness flickered in the back of my mind. But as I stood there in the quiet garage, staring at the envelope, the heavy door connecting to the kitchen suddenly swung open. Zach ran out in his socks, holding a plastic toy screwdriver. He was 5 years old now. He had grown so much, his dark curls bouncing as he sprinted across the concrete floor. "Daddy!" he yelled, throwing his arms around my leg. "Jessica says the pizza is here. Are you coming?" I looked down at him. I looked at his bright, innocent eyes, completely devoid of the darkness, the politics, and the betrayal that had defined his mother's secret life. I thought about the nights I had rocked him to sleep when he cried. I thought about teaching him how to tie his shoes, how to ride a tricycle without training wheels, and how to be a kind, decent human being. I thought about the irrevocable trust fund I had built to ensure he would never have to worry about his future. In that exact moment, looking at my boy, the profound, unshakable truth finally washed over me. It didn't matter. It didn't matter what was printed on a sterile lab report. It didn't matter if Senator Vance shared 50% of this little boy's DNA. Biology is nothing more than a microscopic blueprint. It doesn't make you a father. Showing up every single day, wiping away the tears, carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders to keep them safe, and loving them with a ferocity that defies all logic, that makes you a father. Arthur Vance was a sperm donor who used a tragic accident to score polling points. I was this boy's dad, and nothing on earth could ever change that. "I'm coming, buddy," I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Go tell Jessica I'll be right there." "Let's get the pepperoni." Zach cheered and sprinted back inside, the door swinging shut behind him. I looked at the FedEx envelope one last time. The curiosity was permanently dead. The ghost of the senator was completely exorcised from my mind. I didn't rip the envelope up and I didn't throw it away. I simply placed it back into the bottom of the iron safe, closed the heavy metal door, and spun the dial, locking it away forever. I walked out of the garage and into the bright, warm, chaotic kitchen. Jessica handed me a slice of pizza, leaning up to kiss me softly on the lips, while Lily and Zach argued playfully over the last breadstick. I sat down at the table, surrounded by my beautiful, blended, entirely authentic family. Life had thrown me the most devastating curveball imaginable. It had placed me in the center of a nightmare of deception, betrayal, and sudden tragedy. But I had kept my eyes open, I had protected my children, and I had swung back. And as I sat there, listening to my kids call me Dad, I knew with absolute, perfect certainty that I had hit a home run. A valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound truth to take away from Mark's incredibly emotional journey, it is this. Family is not defined by biology. It is defined by unwavering loyalty, presence, and love. When faced with the ultimate betrayal, Mark could have easily allowed the toxic actions of his late wife and a corrupt politician to permanently poison his. He could have mailed those DNA tests, initiated a public vindictive war against Senator Vance, and allowed his children to become collateral damage in a quest for the truth. But Mark realized something incredibly powerful. Some truths simply aren't worth the peace they cost. Being a parent is an active choice you make every single morning. It is the choice to put your children's emotional and physical safety above your own ego and your own need for revenge. By locking that safe and walking away, Mark stripped the senator of any power he might have ever held. He proved that the man who changes the diapers, pays the bills, and shows up for the nightmares is the only man who truly earns the title of father. Furthermore, Mark's story teaches us that rebuilding after a catastrophic betrayal requires the courage to let the right people back in. If he had allowed Chloe's deception to turn him entirely bitter, he never would have reconnected with Jessica. He never would have built the authentic, deeply loving sanctuary that his family ultimately thrived in. You cannot control the horrific things people do behind your back, but you have absolute control over how beautifully you choose to rebuild your life once the truth is exposed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I want to pass the question off to you. If you were in Mark's shoes, standing in the garage with that sealed envelope, would you have mailed the DNA tests, or would you have locked them away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story. Until next time, take care of yourselves and hold your loved ones close.